"Can I clean your house for a plate of food?" asked the little girl to the solitary Apache, and in that fragile voice trembled the weight of hunger, desperation, and a child's impossible courage. The day was fading into the orange dust of a desert sunset, and the girl's eyes, enormous and tired, reflected a sky that seemed to have forgotten mercy. She was no more than 10, her dress torn, her small hands cracked and roughened by work no child should know. For weeks she had wandered the edges of towns, watching families eat through windows, feeling the burn of emptiness in her stomach, but she had never asked, not until now, not until the silence inside her belly roared louder than her fear. The Apache, whose name was Tatu, stood in the doorway of his modest cabin, a man carved by solitude and years of mistrust. He had lived on the fringes, far from the noise of modern towns, carrying within him stories of displacement, battles he had not fought but inherited, grief passed down like old scars. People rarely came to his cabin, and when they did, it was usually with suspicion or ridicule. Yet here was this child, trembling yet steady, offering labor for bread. He studied her for a long moment, and in her eyes he did not see pity-seeking weakness but a fire that reminded him of something, his younger sister, long gone, who had once carried the same flame of dignity amid hardship. Without a word, he stepped aside and gestured her in. She hesitated, then crossed the threshold, half in fear and half in hope. The house smelled of cedar wood and faint smoke, the simple dwelling of a man who had learned to live with little. On the table lay only a pot of beans, half-eaten, and a cornbread he had saved for later. She stared at it, unable to hide her hunger. "Sit," he said softly, and she obeyed, too weak to argue. He placed food before her without asking again what she wanted. At first she shook her head, as though ashamed to take it, but when he insisted with a steady gaze, she ate, slowly at first, then desperately, as though every bite anchored her soul back to life. He watched in silence, remembering times when he too had gone hungry, when kindness had been withheld, when doors had closed instead of opened. Something stirred in him, an old ache turning into something new, compassion. When she finished, she wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked up at him, her voice trembling. "Thank you. I can clean, I can sweep, I can fetch water, please let me stay for a little while." He should have said no. His life had no room for others, solitude had been both shield and prison. But looking at her thin frame, the smallness of her shoulders carrying such heavy burdens, he could not. "What is your name?" he asked. "Marisol," she whispered. He nodded. "Then, Marisol, you will not clean tonight. You will rest." And so she did. That night, as the desert wind whistled against the cabin walls, Tatu sat awake, watching the small bundle of a girl sleeping by the fire. For years he had believed kindness was wasted, that the world had already turned too cruel to be healed. Yet here, in his cabin, was proof that a single act of compassion could ripple louder than bitterness. In the days that followed, Marisol helped as she promised, sweeping the wooden floors, fetching water from the nearby stream, trying to give back more than she had received. But as she worked, her laughter, a fragile but persistent sound, filled the empty corners of the cabin. Tatu found himself speaking more, telling her stories of the stars, of the desert animals, of his ancestors who had walked with pride. She listened with wide eyes, and in her gaze he felt dignity returning to him, dignity he had thought the world had stripped away. One evening, after sharing roasted corn, Marisol asked, "Why do you live alone?" He hesitated. "Because people have forgotten what it means to live together," he finally said. She frowned. "But not you. You remembered tonight, when you gave me food." Her words struck deeper than she knew, breaking a silence in him that had lasted for years. Slowly, he realized that in saving her from hunger, she was saving him from loneliness. Days turned into weeks, and word of a little girl living with the solitary Apache reached the nearby town. Some came out of curiosity, others out of suspicion. One family, seeing Marisol alive and healthier, offered clothes. Another brought flour. At first, Tatu bristled, he had spent so long expecting judgment, but to his surprise, compassion followed compassion. What had started with a girl's desperate question grew into something larger, a chain of generosity, each act inspiring another. And then came the moment of reckoning. A drought struck the valley, crops withered, and food grew scarce. The townspeople, once wary of the Apache, now turned to him, for he knew how to survive the desert's cruelty. Tatu could have refused, keeping his knowledge for himself and Marisol. Instead, he remembered the night she had asked for food, and how giving had cost him nothing but had changed everything. He taught them how to gather cactus fruit, how to dig for water roots, how to use the desert's harshness as sustenance. Families who had once ignored him now stood with gratitude. Marisol watched with shining eyes, realizing that her small act of courage had become the seed of a community's healing. The true climax came one evening, when a boy from the town approached, timid as Marisol once had, holding a basket of bread. He offered it to Tatu, saying, "For you, because you helped us." In that moment, the Apache, once seen as an outcast, stood as a bridge between people, his solitude broken not by force but by kindness returned. He looked at Marisol, who smiled through tears, and he understood, her hunger had been a gift in disguise, a call that had awakened his humanity and theirs. The story did not end with wealth or comfort, but with something greater, a community reborn through shared compassion. Years later, when Marisol had grown strong and the drought had passed, she would often tell children, "It started the day I asked a stranger for food." He could have closed the door, but instead he opened it. And that door never closed again. The message lingered like desert starlight: one act of kindness can break centuries of silence, one shared meal can restore hope where there was none, and when hearts dare to open, even the loneliest souls can become the roots of a forest of compassion.